In the quiet streets of a forgotten town, a grumpy old mailman walked his lonely route every morning, until a scrappy stray decided to follow him. Some bonds are woven without a word, and only their sudden absence teaches us what they meant. This is the story of a friendship neither of them expected, and one the mailman would never forget. Part 1. The first morning. Walter H. McKinley had walked the same cracked sidewalks of Boone County, Kentucky for nearly 40 years. Each morning before the sun had fully risen, he'd slip on his worn flannel jacket, the one Margaret Jean had given him back in '74, the Christmas before she got sick, and head out with his canvas mail satchel slung over his shoulder. Walter didn't smile much these days. Didn't see much reason to. The town had thinned out like an old sheet hung too many times in the sun. Kids grew up and left. Stores closed their doors for good. The only things that seemed permanent were the stubborn weeds pushing up through the sidewalks and the sighing wind that carried dust from one empty porch to another. It was on a gray Tuesday morning, early in the summer of '87, that Walter first noticed the dog. First he thought it was just his imagination. A dark shape slinking behind a parked Ford pickup, tail low, eyes curious. Walter grunted and kept walking. But at the next corner, there it was again, a scrappy-looking mutt, part shepherd maybe part who knew what. Short brown fur patched with black streaks, one ear flopping while the other stood alert. He was thin, ribs showing under his coat, and his right hind leg had a slight hitch in it, like an old soldier favoring an old wound. Walter frowned. He wasn't much for company, and certainly not for strays. "Go on, Git," he muttered, waving a gloved hand. The dog flinched but didn't run. Instead, he sat back on his haunches, tongue lolling out slightly, as if waiting. Walter sighed and turned back to his route. By the time he reached Maple Street, where Mrs. Kitteridge's blue hydrangeas spilled out like a flood over her cracked white fence, the dog was still there, trotting behind him at a respectful distance. Not whining, not barking, just there. Walter finished his deliveries, stomping back into the post office around noon. He grumbled about the heat to no one in particular, dumped his empty satchel in the back room, and didn't give the dog another thought. The next morning the dog was waiting by the corner of Elm and Vine. Walter paused, staring. The mutt gave a slight wag of his tail, cautious but hopeful. "Lord help me," Walter mumbled. And so it went. Day after day. The dog, whom Walter stubbornly refused to name, would appear at the start of his route, shadow him through the town, and vanish by the time Walter reached the post office. He never begged, never got underfoot, just stayed near, watching with quiet brown eyes. After about a week, Walter found himself slipping a strip of beef jerky from his lunch into his pocket each morning. Just in case, he told himself. He never handed it to the dog directly. No, he'd drop it on the sidewalk somewhere up ahead, mutter something about littering, and keep walking without looking back. But the soft crunch of paws on gravel, the snuffle of a hungry nose, those sounds always followed. The townsfolk started to notice. "Got yourself a new partner," Walter called Old Man Pearson from his rocking chair. "Looks like he's adopted you," laughed Mary Lou from the bakery, wiping flour from her apron. Walter would grunt, tug his cap lower over his brow, and mutter something about how he didn't need a dog slowing him down. But secretly, deep in the quiet chambers of his heart, a thaw was beginning. One morning, when the rains had come heavy and the streets were slick and shining under the weak sun, the dog wasn't waiting. Walter told himself it was better that way. Strays caught all kinds of things: mange, ticks, bad habits. Better he didn't get attached. Still, he found his eyes scanning the alleys as he walked. At the corner of 4th and Cedar, he thought he caught a glimpse, a brown blur vanishing between a stack of old pallets. He slowed his pace. Listen, only the patter of rain. Walter shook himself and trudged on, boots splashing through puddles. That night, after he'd peeled off his soaked jacket and warmed himself with a bowl of Margaret Jean's old chicken stew recipe, the one he still made, even though the spices were never quite right, he found himself standing at the screen door, looking out into the dark, listening. He didn't even realize he was holding a strip of beef jerky in his calloused hand until it slipped and fell to the floor. Walter cursed under his breath and turned away from the door. The dog didn't come back the next day, or the day after. By the third morning, something hollow had started gnawing at Walter's chest. It wasn't a sharp pain, more like an ache, dull and constant, like an old bone remembering every storm that had ever passed through. He walked his route slower now, scanning the empty streets, the abandoned lots, the sagging porches. No wagging tail. No soft pant of breath. No warm, steady presence at his heels. Walter H. McKinley, who had survived wars and funerals and lonely Christmases, found himself talking to the shadows under his breath. "Stupid mutt," he muttered. "Should have known better." Still, every morning, he tucked a piece of jerky into his jacket pocket, just in case. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the cicadas sang their buzzing, lonely song, Walter sat on his front steps, an untouched cup of coffee cooling beside him. He watched the horizon, heart heavier than he'd admit, and wondered why a dog, a nameless, scrappy, limping stray, had managed to stitch himself into the frayed fabric of his days so easily, and why, now that he was gone, everything felt so much colder. Part 2: The search begins. The next morning, Walter rose before the alarm clock rattled on his nightstand. He hadn't slept much. Dreams of muddy paws and wagging tails had haunted him, slipping away like smoke every time he tried to grab hold. He brewed a pot of coffee he barely touched, pulled on his boots, and stood for a long time at the front door, staring at the rising sun bleeding pink across the empty streets. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was just old age making him sentimental. But that morning, Walter McKinley made a decision. He packed a second sandwich along with his usual bologna and mustard, 2 strips of jerky instead of 1, and a battered flashlight, just in case he found himself peering into culverts or behind old sheds. He wasn't just going to deliver the mail today. He was going to find that dog. The streets were cooler than usual, a breath of autumn beginning to creep into the late August air. Leaves rattled along the sidewalks, and the heavy scent of damp earth filled Walter's nose. He started his route the same as always, down Elm, past the broken swing at old Mrs. Thomas's yard, but his pace was slower now. His eyes lingered longer at every alley, every hedgerow, every abandoned tool shed. "Come on, boy," he muttered once, voice rough. "Ain't like I miss you or nothing," but the words felt hollow, even as they left his lips. At the far end of Vine Street, behind the shuttered gas station, he thought he heard a bark, sharp, short, and desperate. He froze. Heart pounding harder than it had in years, Walter moved toward the sound, boots crunching over gravel. Behind a battered dumpster, he found a dog. But it wasn't his dog. This one was a mangy little thing, all ribs and matted fur, with eyes too wild to trust. It growled low in its throat and limped away as Walter approached, vanishing into the weeds. Walter sighed. He lowered himself slowly onto an overturned crate and rubbed the back of his neck. The town was full of strays these days. Full of empty houses, too. Full of empty everything. Maybe he'd just been fooling himself, thinking that dog had been anything more than a shadow passing through. Still, he couldn't quite shake the memory of those quiet brown eyes, full of something old and patient and aching. Walter finished his route on autopilot, left the letters in their boxes, barely noticing the peeling paint or the loose hinges on the doors. Back at the post office, Cindy Harper from the front desk gave him a look as he stomped in, mud on his boots and a slump in his shoulders. "You all right, Walt?" she asked. "Fine," he grunted, brushing past her. But he wasn't fine. He was restless in a way he hadn't been in years. Like something important had slipped from his fingers, and he didn't know how to get it back. That night, he sat by the window long after the last light had faded from the sky. He didn't bother turning on the TV, didn't bother heating up dinner. He just watched, and waited, and somewhere deep in the gnarly places of his heart, the ones he rarely visited anymore, a memory stirred. A boy with scraped knees and a slingshot in his back pocket, calling for a beagle named Rufus down by the creek. A father's voice, rough but kind, telling him that some friends don't stay forever, but the good ones leave a piece of themselves behind. Walter hadn't thought about Rufus in decades. Hadn't thought about how he cried when the old dog didn't come home one winter night, lost somewhere in the endless fields. He rubbed his eyes roughly, cursing himself for being so soft. Just a stray, he told himself. Just an old fool chasing ghosts. But the next morning, Walter packed 2 sandwiches again, just in case. Part 3, Asking Around. Walter H. McKinley had never been one for small talk. He delivered the mail, nodded when spoken to, and kept his words tucked away like old letters no one wanted to read anymore. But that morning, as he tightened the laces on his boots and slipped Margaret Jean's flannel jacket over his shoulders, he made up his mind. He was going to ask. The sky was a soft gray quilt overhead, the kind of sky that smelled like rain waiting to happen. Walter shuffled out onto the porch, glanced down the empty street, and muttered a prayer under his breath. At the first stop on his route, the crumbling white house belonging to Mrs. Marla Kitteridge, he lingered longer than usual after slipping the bills into the mailbox. Mrs. Kitteridge was out front, kneeling painfully in her garden, her hands buried deep in the dirt around her stubborn hydrangeas. Walter cleared his throat. She looked up, squinting against the light. "Mornin', Walter," he tapped the brim of his cap. "Mornin', Marla." There was an awkward pause. Walter scratched the back of his neck. "You, happen to see a dog round here?" "Little scrappy fella. Brown with black patches. Limp in his hind leg." Marla wiped her hands on her apron and leaned on her cane to stand. "You mean that sweet mutt that's been tailing you the past few weeks?" she asked, smiling a little. Walter grunted. "Maybe, haven't seen him," she said, frowning now. "Not for a few days. Thought maybe you'd taken him home." Walter shook his head. "Ain't my dog," but the words tasted wrong on his tongue. Marla's eyes softened. She patted his arm gently. "Sometimes we don't pick family. Sometimes they pick us." Walter mumbled something non-committal and hurried on. At the bakery, Mary Lou handed him a loaf of day-old bread wrapped in brown paper, a silent kindness she'd started since his Margaret passed. "Looking for your shadow today, Walter," she teased gently as she tucked the loaf into his satchel. He stiffened. "Ain't mine," he muttered. But Mary Lou just smiled in that knowing way women have. "Well, if I see him, I'll send him your way." The rest of the route blurred into a slow ache. No brown shape darting across the road. No warm breath puffing in the cold morning air. Just the steady, lonesome sound of Walter's boots against the sidewalk. At lunchtime, instead of heading back to the post office, Walter detoured toward the edge of town. There was an old service station there, long abandoned, its windows broken out and its walls scrawled with fading graffiti. Kids used to dare each other to sneak inside back when Walter was a younger man. He approached slowly, heart thudding. Inside, the station smelled of oil and mold and long-forgotten summers. "Here, boy," Walter called, his voice rough, echoing off the cracked concrete walls. No answer. He knelt down, grunting at the protest of his knees, and set a strip of jerky on the ground. Then he waited. And waited. Outside, a crow called raucously from the rusted gas pump. Walter sighed, standing slowly, joints popping like dry twigs. He left the jerky there, tucked behind a stack of old tires, just in case. The walk home felt longer that day. Every creak of a porch step, every gust of wind through the brittle cornfields made him look up sharply, hope leaping in his chest, only to fall again when he saw nothing but emptiness. That evening, after tossing the untouched loaf of bread onto the counter, Walter pulled out an old shoebox from the closet. Inside were photographs yellowed with age, Margaret Jean smiling wide on their wedding day, his father holding up a fish bigger than his arm, and one photo of a boy, barely 12, laughing as a floppy-eared beagle licked his face. Walter sat heavily in his worn armchair and stared at that picture for a long time. Funny, how grief could wait in the corners of a man's heart for decades, only to rise up with the smallest crack in the armor. He thought he'd patched himself up good over the years. Thought he'd learned how to outwalk loneliness. But that scrappy mutt had snuck in somehow, through the same cracks Walter had stopped guarding. And now the silence he left behind was louder than any bark. Walter placed the photo back into the box, shut the lid carefully, and wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his flannel. Tomorrow, he promised himself. Tomorrow he would search again. Part 4. The first clue. The next morning, Walter was out the door before the sun had fully clawed its way over the horizon. The air was cooler now, crisp enough to turn his breath to mist. He tugged Margaret Jean's flannel tighter around him and set out, his boots echoing against the quiet pavement. Today, he told himself, he wouldn't just walk the route. Today he would search every alley, every ditch, every broken-down shed between Elm Street and the riverbank. He carried a sandwich in one pocket, 2 strips of jerky in the other, and a stubborn hope lodged somewhere deep beneath the years of hard living. By the time the town's bakery opened its doors and the first smell of fresh bread drifted onto Main Street, Walter had already searched half the town. Nothing. He scowled and leaned against a lamppost, catching his breath. "You all right there?" Walt called Sheriff Alvin Brewer, stepping out of the diner with a coffee in hand. Walter hesitated. He wasn't much for sharing. But something about the soft kindness in Al's weathered face broke down the walls a little. "Looking for a dog," Walter muttered. Al cocked his head. "That same mutt that was following you around last month." Walter nodded. Al sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Heard tell from old man Pearson that a brown stray was sniffin' around the abandoned canning factory outside town." Walter straightened. The canning factory had been shuttered since '79, back when the last of the Boone Pickle Company packed up and left. The building was a skeleton now, windows busted out, vines crawling up its brick bones. "Thanks," Walter grunted, already moving. It was a long walk past the edge of town, where the pavement crumbled into gravel and the wild grass grew tall and unbothered. Walter's knees complained with every step, but he ignored them. By the time he reached the factory gates, the sun was a pale coin overhead, struggling to burn away the morning mist. The place looked dead. Rusting machines sat frozen behind broken windows. An old no trespassing sign flapped half-heartedly in the breeze. Walter climbed through a gap in the fence, boots crunching over gravel. "Here, boy," he called, voice low but firm. Only the soft creak of metal answered. He picked his way carefully across the cracked asphalt lot, calling every few steps. Then, near the side loading dock, he spotted it. A paw print. Small, pressed into a patch of mud, already beginning to dry. Walter crouched down, heart thumping. It wasn't much, just a single print, but it was fresh. And it was the right size. The right shape. He wasn't imagining things. The mutt was still out here somewhere. Walter rose slowly, joint stiff. He searched the loading dock first, shining his flashlight into the shadows. Broken pallets, rusted barrels, old coils of wire, but no dog. He circled the building next, poking into every open door, calling softly. In one corner of the factory yard, half hidden by tall weeds, he found an old shipping crate, its side cracked open just wide enough for something small to crawl inside. Walter knelt down, peering into the dark hollow. Inside, nestled among a pile of dry leaves and bits of newspaper, was a nest. A rough bed, pawed into shape by something desperate for shelter. Walter felt the ache in his chest sharpen. The dog had been here. Recently. He pulled a piece of jerky from his pocket and set it gently by the crate's opening. Then he sat down on the ground, ignoring the sharp protest of his knees, and waited. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. The sky shifted overhead, the clouds thinning into ragged strips of white. Walter stayed still, eyes half closed, breathing slow. Once, he thought he heard a soft shuffle in the weeds. He sat up straighter, heart pounding. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you." But nothing came. Finally, when the sun dipped low and painted the factory walls in rust-red light, Walter stood. He left the jerky by the crate. And he left something else, too. A strip of his old flannel jacket, torn carefully from the inside hem. Something that smelled like home. Something that said, "I'm here. I'll wait." As he limped back toward town, the shadow stretching long behind him, Walter realized something. He wasn't just looking for the dog anymore. He was looking for a piece of himself he thought he'd lost a long time ago. Part 5: A Glimpse in the Shadows. The next morning, Walter's bones ached something fierce. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, head bowed, listening to the house creak around him. The slow, tired sighs of a place that had seen too many lonely winters. Part of him, the part that had weathered grief and disappointment, told him to let it be. Told him the dog was just another thing meant to pass through his life. But the bigger part, the part that had once run barefoot along Boone Creek with a beagle at his heels, refused to quit. Walter packed 2 sandwiches, a thermos of weak coffee, and a thick blanket under his arm. He would wait as long as it took. By the time he reached the canning factory again, the morning mist clung to the ground in soft wisps, wrapping the old buildings in ghostly arms. Walter headed straight for the shipping crate. The jerky he'd left was gone. The strip of flannel was still there. But it was crumpled deeper inside, as if something had nosed it, burrowed into it. He crouched low by the crate, heart thudding in his chest. "Hey there, boy," he said softly, voice rough as gravel but gentle all the same. "Just me." "Oh well, Walter." He laid the second sandwich carefully by the crate's opening, unwrapped and waiting. Then he settled himself onto the blanket nearby, crossed his legs with a grunt, and poured a small capful of coffee to warm his hands. The hours dragged by. Birds flitted in and out of the broken windows above. The breeze carried the smell of sun-warmed weeds and rust. Walter dozed now and again, waking with a start at every crunch of gravel, every sigh of the wind. It wasn't until late afternoon, when the sun hung heavy and golden over the fields, that he saw movement. At first it was just a flicker at the edge of his vision, a shadow darting between two rusted barrels. Walter didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited. Slowly, carefully the dog crept into view. It was him. The same scrappy brown mutt, though thinner now, coat tangled and dull. His ribs showed stark beneath his skin, and the limp in his hind leg was worse, dragging slightly as he walked. Walter's throat tightened. The dog approached in stops and starts, paws cautious, nose twitching. When he reached the sandwich, he paused, eyeing Walter warily. Walter dropped his gaze to the ground, making himself small, non-threatening. "Go on, boy," he murmured. "Ain't no strings attached." After a long moment, the dog snatched the sandwich and retreated a few paces, devouring it with frantic hunger. Walter smiled to himself, slow and sad. When the last crumb was gone, the dog looked up again. Their eyes met, brown meeting brown, and something passed between them. Recognition. Memory. A flicker of trust, fragile as a spider's thread. Walter stayed until the sun slipped behind the trees, painting the sky in bruised purples and gold. When he finally stood to leave, he left the blanket folded neatly by the crate, and his old flannel strip tucked inside. The dog watched him go from the shadows, eyes wide and unblinking. Walter didn't look back. Didn't need to. He knew the bond was still there, faint but unbroken. A thread leading through loneliness, through fear, through all the empty places in a man's heart. Tomorrow, he promised. Tomorrow he'd come again. And maybe, just maybe, the dog would take one step closer. Part 6, One Step Closer. Walter didn't sleep much that night. He sat by the window, nursing a cup of cold coffee, watching the stars blink awake in the dark velvet sky. Somewhere out there, under the same stretch of heavens, that scrappy dog was curled up in the hollow of an abandoned crate, alone against the chill. It gnawed at him, that thought. Not just because the dog needed help, because in some quiet, aching way Walter needed him too. At dawn he packed carefully, a fresh sandwich, a slice of Margaret Jean's last jar of peach preserve spread thick between 2 slices of bread, and a clean wool blanket. He even dug out an old leather collar he'd found at the back of the closet, stiff but still strong. The drive to the canning factory was slower this time. His hands, knotted and stiff with age, gripped the wheel tighter than necessary. When he arrived, the sky was just beginning to lighten, streaked with pale gold. The shipping crate was still there. And so was the dog. He lay half inside, half out, his head resting on the folded flannel, brown eyes tracking Walter's every move. Walter crouched a few feet away and set down the sandwich. He didn't reach for the dog, didn't call him, just sat there, cross-legged on the cracked concrete, sipping from his thermos, sharing the morning air. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, slowly, like a man testing the ice of a frozen river, the dog stood. He limped forward, ribs stark against his thin sides, and stopped just an arm's length away. Walter didn't move. He held out a small piece of the sandwich, palm up, open and easy. The dog's nose twitched. Then in a breathless, trembling moment, he crept forward and snatched the food from Walter's hand. Their fingers brushed fur and skin, and for the first time, Walter felt the warmth of him, the tremble of fear and hunger and hope bundled together. Walter smiled, slow and soft. "Good boy," he murmured. "Ain't so bad, is it?" The dog sat back on his haunches, chewing furiously, eyes never leaving Walter's face. Carefully, Walter slid the collar from his jacket pocket and laid it on the ground between them. No rush, no demands, just a quiet offering. The dog eyed it, suspicious. Walter chuckled low in his chest. "Ain't no trap, son. Just means you belong somewhere." The dog crept forward, sniffing at the leather, then retreated a step, unsure. Walter leaned back against a rusted barrel, stretching his legs out in front of him. He told the dog about the town, about the old bakery and the sagging houses and the way the river smelled in the springtime. He talked about Margaret Jean, how she used to bake pies so sweet the whole neighborhood smelled like apples and cinnamon. He told him about Rufus, too, the floppy-eared beagle who had chased him through every field and puddle until the day he didn't come home. The dog listened. Not with words, but with slow blinks and tilted ears, the way only animals can. The sun climbed higher, and the morning warmed. When Walter rose to leave, he didn't take the collar. He left it there, alongside a fresh piece of jerky and the folded wool blanket. Promise, not a leash. A choice, not a command. As he climbed into his truck, Walter glanced back one last time. The dog was standing over the collar now, head low, tail giving the faintest, uncertain wag. Walter smiled to himself, deep and wide, and turned the ignition. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow would be the day. Part 7: The Choice. The next morning, the clouds rolled in heavy and low, dragging the sky into a deep gray hush. Walter stood on his porch for a long moment, hand on the old screen door, feeling the storm in his bones before the first raindrop ever fell. He should have stayed home. A man his age had no business traipsing through abandoned factories in the rain. But something stronger than sense pulled at him, a thread he couldn't bear to snap. He packed 2 sandwiches, the thermos and a dry towel, tucking them all into an oilskin bag Margaret Jean had once used for her Sunday picnics. The drive out to the canning factory was slow, tires hissing against the wet roads. Trees leaned under the weight of the coming storm, their leaves whispering warnings Walter chose not to hear. When he pulled up by the old fence, he saw him. The dog. Sitting out in the open this time, at the edge of the lot, the wool blanket damp but clutched between his paws like a treasure. Walter's heart gave a painful thud against his ribs. He climbed out of the truck slowly, hands open, letting the rain soak into his jacket without caring. "Hey there, boy," he called softly, voice nearly lost in the rising wind. The dog stood, tail low, body trembling from cold or fear. Maybe both. Walter crouched low, ignoring the ache in his knees. "You ready?" he asked, as if they were just 2 old friends about to set out on a familiar road. The dog took a step forward. Pause. Another step. Closer now. Close enough that Walter could see the tiny scar above his left eye, the way his ears quivered with uncertainty. "You're not alone," Walter whispered, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. Not anymore. The dog looked at him, really looked, and in that moment, the space between them disappeared. He bolted forward, slamming into Walter's chest with a desperate kind of force, all ribs and shivering fur and trust so raw it nearly broke him. Walter wrapped his arms around the dog, feeling the tremors ripple through the thin body, the rapid heartbeat hammering against his own. "It's all right, boy," he murmured, pressing his face into the wet, matted fur. "You're home now." For a long moment they stayed like that, 2 old souls stitched together by loss, by hope, by something too deep for words. Finally, Walter pulled back just enough to slip the old leather collar around the dog's neck. It wasn't about ownership. It was about belonging. The dog didn't flinch, didn't fight. He leaned into Walter's hands, tail thumping weakly against the cracked concrete. Walter rose slowly, lifting the dog into his arms, feeling the wiry strength beneath the ragged coat. He carried him to the truck, setting him gently on the passenger seat, tucking the towel around him. As he climbed behind the wheel, Walter glanced over. The dog was watching him, eyes half closed, head drooping with exhaustion. Walter smiled. "Guess you need a name," he said. He thought for a moment, tapping the steering wheel. "How about Scout?" he said finally. "On account of you finding me just as much as I found you." Scout blinked slowly, as if in agreement, and laid his head on Walter's lap. The storm broke over Boone County as Walter drove them home. Rain hammering the windshield, wind howling through the trees. But inside the truck, there was only warmth. Only the steady, quiet rhythm of 2 broken things made whole again. Together. Part 8: A Home for Two. The rain hadn't let up by the time Walter pulled into his driveway. Came down in thick, slanting sheets now, drenching the town in a heavy, cold mist. The gutters overflowed, spilling muddy water into the cracked streets. Walter parked the truck, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, listening to the steady drum of rain on the roof. Scout stirred beside him, lifting his head, ears flicking uncertainly. Walter reached over, rough hand gentle on the scruffy fur. "It ain't much," he said quietly, looking toward the sagging porch, the peeling paint, the wind chime clinking weakly in the storm. "But it's ours now." He opened the door, holding the towel like a shield as he bundled Scout into his arms again, the dog too weak yet to protest. The porch steps groaned under his weight, but they held. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood, old paper, and the faintest memory of Margaret Jean's lavender soap. Walter set Scout down carefully on a thick quilt spread beside the fireplace. The hearth hadn't seen a real fire in years. only the occasional flicker when winter cut too deep. But today, Walter built one with steady, deliberate hands, kindling, then bigger logs. The flames caught with a low, eager crackle, throwing warmth into the room, chasing shadows from the corners. Scout curled up tighter on the quilt, trembling from exhaustion but no longer from fear. Walter dug through the kitchen, the old metal cupboard screeching in protest, until he found a can of beef stew. He heated it over the stove, thin wisps of steam rising to fill the house with a smell so rich even Walter's stomach gave a small, surprised rumble. He spooned a generous helping into a chipped bowl and set it beside Scout, watching as the dog lifted his head, sniffed and began eating with slow, grateful bites. Walter sat down heavily in his armchair, the same one he'd sat in every night for 20 years, and watched the rain beat against the window. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't reach for a book, just sat there, breathing in the simple peace of a life no longer lived alone. Scout finished the stew, licked the bowl clean, and crawled over stiff, cautious, to lay his head against Walter's boot. Walter looked down, his heart breaking wide open at the trust in that small, quiet gesture. He reached down, resting his hand gently atop Scout's head. "You're a stubborn one," he said. Fitton took one to find the other. The storm raged outside, but inside the house grew warm, the fire crackling low and steady. Later Walter dozed off, head tilted back against the chair, the soft weight of Scout pressed against his feet. And for the first time in a long, long while, the dreams that found him were not of loss. They were of younger days, of creeks and beagles, of laughter bouncing between the trees, of a boy and his dog running wild under the open sky. Only now there was a new shadow at his heels, a new companion fierce and loyal and stubborn as sin. Scout, not the ghost of something lost, but something found, something chosen. When Walter woke to the soft gray light of dawn, the storm spent and the world washed clean, he found Scout still there, breathing slow and even against his boots. And in the quiet of that small, battered house, Walter McKinley smiled. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow they'd start fresh. A man, a dog, and all the morning still left between them. Part 9. New routines. By the time September deepened into October, the trees in Boone County had caught fire with color. The maples blazed red and gold, the oaks stood heavy and proud in russet coats, and the streets, though quieter than they had once been, glowed with a kind of quiet, stubborn beauty. Walter and Scout had found their rhythm. Each morning, Walter would rise with the sun, shrug on his flannel jacket, now patched and faded, and fix 2 breakfasts, one for himself, one for Scout. Scout had filled out some. His ribs no longer showed like bones under his coat, and his limp, while still there, had smoothed into something almost noble, the walk of a dog who had fought for every step and earned every scar. After breakfast, they walked the mail route together. Walter had worried at first that Scout would shy from town folk, but the opposite happened. Slowly, day by day, he had earned his place. The children from the one-room schoolhouse on Vine Street would run to the gate when they saw them coming, calling, "Morning, Mr. McKinley, morning, Scout." Old Mrs. Kitteridge kept dog biscuits in her apron pocket, pretending she needed help reaching the mailbox just so she could sneak Scout a treat. Even Sheriff Brewer tipped his hat when they passed, grinning wide enough to show the missing tooth he refused to fix. Walter didn't say much about it. He just walked a little taller, a little prouder. Some days were harder than others. There were mornings when Walter's knees swelled so badly, he had to sit on the porch steps while Scout nosed impatiently at his elbow, ready to go. There were nights when the house felt a little too quiet, the ache of Margaret Jean's absence pressing heavier against the walls. But Scout was always there, a steady presence, breathing slow beside his chair, waiting by the door, padding into the kitchen whenever Walter moved about like he didn't trust the old man to manage alone. They were 2 battered souls stitched together by the same thread, survival. Neither needed grand declarations. Neither needed more than the simple, powerful promise their footsteps made side by side. One evening, as the first frost silvered the fields and the pumpkins sagged heavy on their vines, Walter found himself at the river's edge. It was the same spot he hadn't visited since he was a boy, since Rufus had vanished into the tall grass all those decades ago. Scout sat beside him, tail thumping slowly against the damp earth. Walter stared out across the water, its surface catching the last light of day, and felt the years fold in on themselves, the losses, the loves, the long walks alone. He knelt down, bones creaking, and rested a hand on Scout's scruffy head. "You know," he said, voice low, "I reckon I needed you more than you ever needed me." Scout pressed closer, the weight of him grounding Walter to the earth. In the hush of the fading light, Walter whispered the thing he hadn't said out loud. Not to Margaret, not to Rufus, not even to himself. "Thank you." Scout didn't answer. He didn't need to. The river moved on. The leaves fell. The night gathered around them, soft and sure. And Walter H. McKinley, once a gruff old mailman who had forgotten how to hope, sat by the river with his dog and remembered what it felt like to be found. Part 10. The last letter. Winter settled hard over Boone County that year. The days shrank small and brittle, the nights stretching long and deep. Snow fell heavy across the rooftops, softening the edges of the world until the whole town seemed to hold its breath. Walter and Scout adjusted. They took shorter walks now, Scout bundled in an old knitted scarf Mrs. Kitteridge had fashioned for him, Walter moving slower but steady, each step deliberate against the frozen streets. The townsfolk smiled when they saw them, the old man and the dog, weathered but undefeated. Christmas came and went with little fanfare. Walter didn't hang lights, didn't put up a tree, but he did leave a bone wrapped in butcher paper under the kitchen table, where Scout sniffed it out with a wagging tail and wide, surprised eyes. It was enough. In late January, Walter caught a cold that wouldn't quite let go. It started with a cough he brushed off, then a fever he tried to sweat out with hot tea and stubbornness. Scout stayed at his side, a warm, steady presence in a world that blurred and spun around the edges. One morning, Walter woke to the weak sunlight filtering through the frosted window, and he knew. Somehow, in the way animals and old men sometimes know things without words, he understood that he had come to the end of his road. There was no fear, no regret, just a deep, bone-deep tiredness, and a quiet peace. He shuffled to his writing desk, an old oak thing battered from years of use, and pulled out a single sheet of yellowed paper. With slow, careful strokes, he wrote, "To whoever finds this. His name is Scout. He's a good dog, the best kind. Give him a warm place to sleep, a full belly, and a hand to rest his head on now and then. He'll give you the world in return. Thank you. Walter H. McKinley." He folded the paper and tucked it into Scout's collar, patting the dog's head one last time. Scout whined low in his throat, sensing the shift, pressing closer, refusing to leave Walter's side. Walter smiled. "It's all right, boy," he whispered, voice thin and cracking. "You did good. You did real good." He settled back into his chair by the fire, Scout curled against his feet. Outside, the snow fell steady and soft, blanketing the town in silence. Sometime in the quiet hours of the afternoon, as the fire burned low and the world drifted further away, Walter closed his eyes. And he did not wake again. Scout stayed with him until the sun dipped behind the hills, the house wrapped in the hush of early twilight. It was Mrs. Kitteridge who found them the next day, following a worry in her chest she couldn't explain. She wept when she saw Walter, hands trembling, but she smiled through her tears when Scout nuzzled her hand, the note still tucked safe in his collar. The town came together after that. They buried Walter under the old oak by the river, the place he loved best, on a cold, clear morning where the sky stretched wide and endless overhead. Scout sat by the grave the whole time, quiet and still, the wind stirring the fur around his ears like a blessing. Afterward, Mrs. Kitteridge took him home. He had a bed by the fire, a full bowl and a porch to patrol. Children called for him by name when they played in the street. Neighbors slipped him treats and scratched his ears. And every Sunday, without fail, Scout would walk down to the riverbank and sit for a spell by the old oak, staring out across the water, waiting. Not with sadness, not with loss, but with the kind of steady, endless loyalty that only dogs, and the best of men, ever truly understand. And in Boone County, whenever someone saw that scrappy brown dog limping through the streets, tail wagging slow and proud, they'd smile and say, "There goes the mailman's friend."